And the idea of bringing everybody together was to standardize practices, especially in the areas of acquisitions and fiscal responsibility, but also providing the experts with support as a group so that the problems of the different scripts were similar in ways that even though they are different languages, the issues of how do you embed those different scripts in records is one of the things we brought together. And the other thing about this model is that it was a one-stop model. The same staff were responsible for acquisitions functions as well as cataloging functions. And like a tech services unit in a small library, the staff had this range of responsibilities, different from the rest of the large Penn libraries where we separated out by functional responsibilities, with acquisitions functions generally separated from cataloging functions. One of the things we identified is that there were problems with backlogs, and the staff was insufficient to cover all of our collecting in these global areas. And so we needed ways to use technology to cover those staffing gaps. Sometimes it was just not enough staff to handle the collecting in a given language, and sometimes it was staffing gaps of expertise altogether, a language or a script that we had we were collecting in but didn't have staff to support. When we hired Mike as the head of the Global Studies Tech Services Unit, we wanted him to focus on how we could use technology to better support our tech services operations, and using the tools that we had, both a responsive MLS that is a system, we use Alma now, that would allow the staff that are doing the work to do things like batch loads, like reports and analytics that we didn't previously were embedded in our IT unit and had to do requests to do. So having the advantage of putting the tools where they were needed, as well as looking at external tools. And Mike is going to take it over now to talk about how we used and identified some of these tools to make our workflows more responsive to meet all of our needs.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, so with technology in mind, there were some sort of guiding principles behind what we were trying to achieve here, as Beth was saying. So in pursuing technology, we wanted to find out what was the best quality metadata we could get at the time of acquisitions or at a cataloging process with as little manual work as possible. And I'm talking about copy and paste transactions, which were pretty much the standard before we moved on to Alma. We wanted to use existing software applications that were familiar to staff, that required as little bit of customization as possible, so that it would be easy to respond and learn to. But we also wanted to stretch the skill sets of those staff to become more competent in these software usages. Everyone had Excel, but some people only really know how to use it to make a list or to do simple arithmetic. So we really wanted to make them stronger power users of it. And we wanted to create workflows that were open to change over time, because things break, vendors change, new data becomes available, and make it transparent so everybody knew what we were doing. But most of all, we really wanted to get these books off of shelves and into patron hands as quickly as possible. So that motivated a lot of the reason why we were doing these things in batch. So one of the core workflows that we have is using two tools, neither of which were developed at Penn. One is Matchmark, and the other is MarkEdit. And how these two fit together is with tabular data, which is mostly enabled by ISBNs from vendors and other acquisition sources in Excel. Matchmark, some of you may have attended a recent core presentation given by the developers at Lehigh University. They're great. I've been in contact with them, and I was one of their early testers. You can find out more information about them at that link, and that'll be later in the resources. But what this software is, it's a plugin for Google Sheets, where if you have an API key for OCLC and you have a list of ISBNs or LCCNs, it can batch query them in OCLC and return data that you specify. That data comes back in a Google Sheets, so it's essentially in tabular format. So you can easily match that with data that was already in Excel. And then if you've got a table of data, you can use MarkEdit, which is a widely deployed, free-to-use software out there, and transform Excel spreadsheets into brief or complex MARC records, and then load those into your system. And those for us form the basis of our acquisitions records and sometimes of later cataloging. And then of course, one other thing Matchmark can do is email you all of the MARC records with the specified OCLC numbers that they return in MARC XML format. And those can very easily be converted into MARC files and loaded into your system. So you can sort of batch catalog everything. So at the time you order it, it's already ready to go when it arrives. I'll show you a couple of images of this in action, and got a little laser pointer up here. So I hope this shows up for everybody. So this is some sample vendor data that we had in Excel. Doesn't really look like much, but they gave us some ISBNs, which are critical for a workflow. There were some titles in Chinese, author, publisher also in Chinese, a year, great. Those form the basis of really good cataloging, which will be an accurate 008 field. I know it's published in China, it's in Chinese, and it's in 2020. That's gonna be great for faceted searching. We also have some acquisitions-y data here. There's price, which we'll pay to the vendor, and then local acquisitions information, which is our selector's name, just to record the audit trail. We've got a fund name and a location, and these things will all get bundled into MARC records. But this doesn't look like much. However, if we run these ISBNs through some criteria and Matchmark, we can get some good results. And down here, you can see that the criteria, and I realize it's a little bit small here, but this is sort of the out-of-the-box criteria. We said, find me records with these ISBNs that are from a Library of Congress. Failing that, get me something that was coded PCC. Failing that, just get me any old record you can find in English. And what I specified for Matchmark to return is three basic things. It could be more, it could be less, but the 001, which is the OCLC number. The 245 subfield A, which is just the main title. I only really need that for acquisitions. And then a call number. You know, is it cataloged already? Because a call number is a great sign that the record is fully formed and ready to go. So that says, give me the 050 field or an 090 if you find that. And you can see the interface here. There's the API key here. And we did the search and it spat out these records here. We've got the OCLC numbers, title data in Romanized title, which really helps because everything was in Chinese and I didn't want to have to type that up by hand. And then we've got some call numbers here. So this data very easily integrates into Excel. And I was able to use that to make very brief MARC records that could be loaded into our system. You can see I got the OCLC embedded number here. And then Matchmark, I said, send me all the records that you found, and this is the results. So at this point in the process, I could either merge these two records and then load them into our system. My preference is to load these first, get all the acquisition stuff taken care of. This generates orders in our system. And then later I batch overlay all of the records here. So in many cases, we've already cataloged what could be dozens, hundreds of selections at once, with just a few simple transactions, or at least what I would consider simple transactions. Okay, so moving on to the next thing. So obviously Matchmark relies on ISBNs or LCCNs. We don't always have that kind of data. However, the web is rich in data sources, and I have used some web scraping tools in order to get things like ISBNs or titles or whatever, less LCCNs, but you know, it's feasible that it's out there. So Google Sheets, which is like Excel for the web, connected to your Google account, has some special formulas that don't work in Excel, but do work in Google Sheets. And I'll demo one today, but there's three import functions that are great. Import HTML. If you have a web structure in HTML that's a list, which is a UL or OL tag, or a table, the table tag, it can just ingest that data for you. The import XML formula is a lot more flexible, and it can target pretty much any old HTML tag. If your data is in a div or a span or a heading 2 tag, great, it can draw that in. With one caveat, if the HTML was generated by JavaScript, at this time, this is not supported by Google Sheets import XML function. So that's a difficult workaround. And then there's an import data function that queries CSV or TSV, you know, comma separated value or tab separated value data online, but in many cases, you could just copy and paste those into Excel anyway. One other big caveat, sometimes Google limits the import transactions that are running at any given time. So the process can be slow and hangs. So, you know, if you've got a lot of data at once, you might have to do it in stages. So what does this look like? Well, here is a sample bookseller's website. You can see there's 4 different titles here. There's some search results, and I've got some metadata here. There's a title, and I've got an author, and I've got a price here. But if I clicked through, I go to another page, which is individual book metadata. You can see it's the same data up here. Here's the title, author, a price here in rupees. And then down here, though, I've got this really tantalizing table of metadata that looks like this could be the basis of a really useful bib record in our system. I want to get this, and I don't just want to get this record. I probably want to get dozens, possibly hundreds of data, URL data ingested into Google Sheets. And here's how I would do that. So again, this is the individual book metadata back here. But behind the scenes in the HTML, you can see it's got structure. And you can view this by, in your browser, you might want to right click and view source. What I tend to do in Chrome is I click on the thing I want and inspect element. So in this case, I right clicked on the ISBN and chose inspect element. I'm sorry, I don't have an image of what that looks like. It's not easily captured, but you can see the ISBN lives in the HTML here in this strong tag, but it's also a part of a larger block of stuff, which lives in this element, this div. And this div has properties. It's a class, it's an accordion content. It has an ID, which seems pretty promising. So I want to isolate this, and I can do that with Google Sheets' import XML format function rather. So what I told Google Sheets to do here is take the URL that is present in cell A1, and that's the book page. And then it's a special XPath query. This is the syntax. And I said, go find the div whose ID is panel 1D. And it finds it right here and spits out all of this information, which happily enough is author, ISBN, year, language, pages. It's all this data that's over here. So this was a really easy way to ingest a lot of bibliographic information all at once. And it wouldn't just be with one URL, but again, it just would be with dozens of URLs. So in that case, and I'll just hit back really quickly, in this case, it was kind of formatted for me. It spat itself out across cells, which was great. I could do a little cleanup and batch replace the words ISBN 10 and colon. That's not too difficult. But the web indeed is structured, but not always the way we want. So Google Sheets might just spit out the data in ways you didn't expect it to happen, with weird line breaks or across multiple cells. And you might have to deploy some cleanup tasks on your own, customized for whatever project you're working on. And this is not something that you immediately grasp. It's totally trial and error. I'm showing you things that took me weeks to develop. So it's not quite out of the box, but you can make it work. So some data indeed is semi-formatted, right? This is another vendor's page here. And you can see there's a couple of metadata elements I've separated out. There's a title up here, and then there's an artist or author, whoever that is, a publisher. There's some price metadata up here. And then there's that real heavy bibliographic bookie data, that ISBN that I would love to run through Matchmark. And so this yellow box here, I've sort of separated out what the HTML source is. When I right click here, I figure out, okay, here's where that ISBN is. It lives in this DD tag. This is part of a description list here. And unfortunately, the DL tag doesn't work in Google Sheets import HTML list functions. So it looks like it's part of this div here. That's all the book details. So that looks like where I would start. And then I end up scraping the div whose class equals details. You can see that bit right here, but it spits it out on this one mega block. And you can see it looks like the block was all spit out here. And that's not ideal. But if you get this kind of data, you can work with it. And sometimes you will have to do some basic Excel formulas to clean it up. So if I ended up with this block, well, and if I just wanted the ISBN, I could use a write formula and just kind of pull it out. There's so many ways to do this. If I really wanted to do something like find the stuff in the middle, you can see this ends up looking like a lot more complex transaction, but custom formulas deployed for hundreds of URLs might actually give you a lot of good results here. And then finally, all the metadata wasn't in the same part of the HTML, so I would have had to scrape a couple of things. So there's one import XML function happening here and another one happening over here to target a different div whose class is header. So again, if I've got hundreds of these URLs, this is going to work for me. But there's a lot of trial and error. And maybe the first time around wasn't the best way to do it. So when I looked at the data a second time, I thought, well, why did I try and scrape the details? Why don't I just try a lower order of tag? And if I tried just to import the XML for the DL tag here, it turns out that I could easily separate this across cells. Google just formatted for me because it interpreted each of these things as a line break, which is great. So if my only choice would have been to go with the first option, I could have cleaned it. But sometimes just further experimentation reveals better answers. So it is an iterative process. And all of this looks like acquisitions data, and it is in some cases. But we can also deploy this to do some duplicate checking because we don't want to spend money on books we've already purchased or own. So we can use this tabular data, again, with ISBNs. Sometimes they come from vendors or sometimes minimal staff input, depending on it. And I've got two workflows here that work for me. One is a locally designed Google Sheet method that uses import XML functions, and it checks our catalog website. But again, it can be subject to stalled performance because of how Google handles the import functions. And there's also a non-public but very helpful tool that I have the privilege to work with from Princeton. It is a lookup in local catalog tool. It's a plugin for Excel, and it really relies on the happy accident that both Penn and Princeton are using a blacklight catalog structure. So it was a tool that was shared with me, and I'll just kind of show you what that looks like. And our LMS Alma also has a build a set function, so you could batch upload ISBNs and see, do we have them already? But it doesn't easily integrate with tabular data, so it's a little bit clunkier for us. So I'll just show you these methods. Again, I won't dwell too much on this because it was sort of a custom thing, but if there's IT solutions out there, great. This Princeton tool developed to check ISBNs, or really check anything in the catalog, can query something in a blacklight catalog and return data that you specify. So I'm using the ISBN mode here and telling it to return whether we have the ISBN or not, which is a true false, the ISBN, just to compare it, a title, which is great. We want to know what the thing is. And then I give it a very specific request. Give me the 880 subfield A, which is linked to the 245. For those of you who don't work with non-Latin data, this was essentially saying, give me the title of the book as it is written in a foreign script. And you can see the data spit out here, same ISBNs. False, we don't have this one. True, we have this one, and here's the title. So I could say these are duplicates, we should not purchase them. And it was easy to identify those. The web scrape method, it's not as quick, but it's a little bit more accessible. And in this one, it looks like a pretty complicated formula, but it's not. It's only telling you two things. Try and search for this ISBN as part of our Franklin catalog search. And if you find it, get us the local system number, which can be found in the div whose class is blah, 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 blah. And then if it doesn't find that, the if function just says, we'll just put the words no Franklin result found just to tell me you didn't find it. And it's the same results as above, almost. You can see the first one did not return a result, just as this tool did not return a result. And this fourth line, and this is where it gets messy, it's a slow search. It's loading, it's loading, it's loading. It loaded for hours, actually. And sometimes this kind of stuff just happens when you're using tools that are managed by third parties like Google, where there's not much in the way of customer service. So sometimes you just kind of need to figure it out or wait or try something else. So this homegrown method mostly works, and several of my partner bibliographers are using that right now. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of just kind of putting together all the tools that you have and making a workflow of it. And the title of this presentation, Batch is the New Bespoke, was one, I like alliteration, but also I wanted to emphasize that once upon a time, our transactions were so individualized. It was a copy and paste and save and copy and paste. But instead of focusing on those kind of very repeatable transactions, the intellectual labor can shift to more challenging and fun and interesting analyzing design processes, cleaning and enhancing, and really up your skill sets as well as those of your staff. And there's process has challenges. All data is different, right? Not every book has an ISBN, not every ISBN is an OCLC, and sometimes when it is, it's a different record, not what you expected, wrong title, different format, and not every web page can be scraped or cleaned easily because of the way it's structured. It's generated by JavaScript, or it just spits out a block of data that you really can't work with. So as you approach a process like this, you really need to understand the realities and the limits of the tools you have, the staff that you have, and the results that you're looking for, but also negotiate with them so you can get some good outcomes that Beth is going to present about right now.
So just to kind of give you some general ideas of the outcomes that we've had of using this process. We moved from a situation where we had a lot of batch orders that were not well represented in our system. For example, the bibliographer would email a list of 100 titles on a spreadsheet to a vendor, and the only thing recorded in the local system was that we paid X amount of dollars for 100 titles. And we may not even record those individual titles until the books were actually received. Bibliographers, and then there were other cases where we were doing one at a time orders, but very, very brief records without a lot of data. And the defaults in the system didn't make it easy to even put in the language of the title. So we would have lots of things saying they were English language that were clearly in Chinese or Japanese or Arabic. So we have much richer order records. And more importantly, we have accurate budget information. There were all of these, they call them shadow systems, where bibliographers had to track what they were spending because the orders weren't showing up in the system until the items were received in-house. So in order to know how much they had remaining in their budget, they were using tracking. So now we can do the same kind of budget tracking for the area studies bibliographers, the global studies bibliographers, as the rest of the bibliographers. And then really key, the staff skills. Mike is spending a lot of time as a supervisor of this unit figuring out how it works with vendor X or vendor Y. But once we have a pattern, we're training the individual language expert to do the work, whether it's Excel work or MarcEdit work or MatchMark, so that they are learning these new skills and can track when it's working and when it's not. And maybe if the vendor changes their site or their information, we need to go back and reiterate again, is this the best approach? But it's a trickle down to the staff. And then Mike, if you go to the next slide, we also have set in place abbreviated cataloging, and this is good cataloging that we do contribute. It's mark and coding level 3 records. It has accurate OOH of language, country, and date. But we are cataloging for remote storage, so we don't need a shelf label because remote storage is shelved by barcode. So we can actually finish these in the sense that they are available, requestable by the users without intervention. When things are in our backlogs, yes, we can retrieve them and catalog and get them to the users, but it takes human intervention. Once things are left the backlogs and gone to the remote storage, it's very easy and timely for users to request, and they're also available through ILL. And we don't do this like indiscriminately. It's generally areas where we have older, large backlogs in understaffed areas, or places where we have languages without expertise. We have staff that maybe have a half a dozen or a dozen different Indian languages, but there's dozens and dozens of languages that we collect in that we just don't have that expertise. Or and sometimes in the past, before COVID, we were able to hire students that had those languages, such as Thai and Mongolian. But now we're doing the best we can with the expertise at hand. And having these batch tools gives us the ability to finish records enough so that their items move out of backlogs and are available to patrons. And we'll end with showing you some of our resources that Mike mentioned along the way. And these will be in the slides when we post them. And happy to take questions when we get to the question and answer period. But also later on, we have our emails there for if you want to contact us for follow-up.
Thank you so much, Michael and Beth. And Jennifer, when you're ready, feel free.
Great, thank you. So let me just share my screen. And So can you see my screen? I guess I'll take that as a yes. Hi, everyone.
That's a yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm working on a small laptop, so I don't see the chat, but I will see your chats afterwards. Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Eustace. I'm from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And I want to thank everyone and Jesse and Sarah for being able to talk to you today about collaborations, consortia, and conundrums. And I've had fun with this presentation, and you'll see why this is about a migration that we're currently in, the UMass Amherst, and I will be speaking about that. So my presentation is going to go into a little bit an introduction. What is the 5-college consortium? We call it 5C or FC, and its migration to Folio, which is the Future of Libraries is Open Library Service Platform. We just shorten that to Folio. That's much easier to remember. Kind of the official mechanisms for collaboration, more at the consortium level, but that are by extension also applied at each institution. And then I'll also talk about what happens at the Folio level briefly. Then I'll talk about all the conundrums and issues that I'm sure if you've done a migration, you probably know many of them already, so I'm not spoiling anything. And then I want to talk about, just in closing, about what makes a successful collaboration, at least in our 5 colleges, and how does this influence the migration and whether or not that's successful. So the 5-college consortium, what is it and what is our migration project? The 5-college consortium actually was incorporated in 1965, but dates back to 1914. Yes, it is an old consortium. Of course, originally it wasn't the 5 colleges, it was much smaller, but today it consists of Smith College, Hampshire College, Mount Holyoke, Amherst College, and UMass Amherst. University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So we are all located in Western Massachusetts in what is called the Pioneer Valley, which today it's very snowy. So hopefully when we can travel, I do encourage you to come visit us. The consortium was born out of a successful collaboration between basically academic affairs, so providing courses to the students at the various member institutions. Library subscriptions were added in 1966, and since that time, more library services were added. And of course, our ILS, which is currently OLIF. OLIF is an ex libris product. Maybe many of you still run it, maybe not. OLIF has reached its end of life. And with all old ILS, it is, time to migrate. And the 5 college had a working group that decided that in 2018. And the decision was quite a departure for the 5 colleges. And here I'm sharing the announcement made by EBSCO in 2018. The decision was to migrate to Folio. The Future of Libraries is Open Library Service Platform, which in 2018, there wasn't much. Folio was still very much a concept. Of course, now there are some libraries running on Folio, and even in the 5 colleges, we are running our ERM. So it's a suite of apps, as we call it, in Folio. So the departure is for us is we've always gone vended solutions. So this is an open source community, it's an open source project. So it's very different from the other migrations that have taken place in the 5 colleges. But not to worry, or maybe to worry, I'm not sure. In terms of collaboration, the 5C has, of course, as I just mentioned, a very long history of collaborations and successful collaborations. And for this migration, what we call a Folio implementation team was set up early in 2018 to kind of be inspired from those collaborations that have already taken place for years in the 5C and adopt them to our current migration. And how did we do this? So I really like this image of the dual pyramid. And I did not create this. This was actually created by the department head at UMass, I think. Kathleen Berry, the department head of information resource management. And this has been shared not just by her, but by other members of our Folio implementation team to illustrate both collaboration and communication. Those go hand in hand. So the idea here is at the consortial level, there are members of there are staff at the member institutions who are part of working groups. Another term, you could use committee. These committees or working groups have chairs or leads, as we call them. The leads always are collaborate with a liaison from FIT, as well as a 5C folio kind of implementation head. And we also sometimes, I'm the chair of one of those working groups. We sometimes attend the folio implementation team meetings. And then of course, there's the head of the entire project of the migration who attends what is called the FCLC, which is the 5C Consortium Library Council. It's basically the deans or the heads of all the libraries of all the member institutions. It's the executive council for the 5 consortium kind of library services. So that collaboration goes up and then the collaboration goes down. And the idea is to have a transparent and hopefully efficient kind of collaboration between all the levels in the consortium. This is by extension adapted by the institutions who also have some working groups, but mostly it's the staff that participate in these consortial working groups that bring information back to the institution. And of course, our implementation team is comprised of a member or liaison of generally it's a department head, but not necessarily, from each of the member institutions. And this is really to facilitate open, transparent, both collaborations and communication for this migration, which is necessary. Folio is actually quite similar, and I really enjoyed doing research for this presentation because I found out that the 5C was based on a successful collaboration in 1914, but Folio, the Future of Libraries is Open, defines itself as a collaboration of libraries, developers, and vendors. So building a brand new open source library service platform, which sounds a little crazy, but it's actually a really interesting project, and of course one that we're on that road. We're already live with e-resource management, and we're going live summer to fall of this year. But Folio mirrors kind of the official structure of collaboration of the 5C in that there are spaces for certain types of collaborations. Those between, for example, developers. Here, you have GitHub, issue trackers. Folio uses Jira. There's documentation. There are meetings between subject experts and all that. And of course, there is on top of that pyramid, there are the product council as well as a technical council that kind of steer the community forward in developing and making sure that Folio grows, which is really interesting. Of course, the Folio community is much larger than the 5C community. The 5C is really 5 institutions in Western Massachusetts, where Folio is an international collaboration. So this spans all over the globe right now, which I find really fascinating because it brings in a bit of a twist, not just to the migration, but also what it means to collaborate. So what do I mean by that? Well, migrations, yeah, they're so much fun. But what they really are is they're extremely disruptive. And I really like this image. It's the lava flow. So when you think that everything might be okay, boom, there it goes. There's so much happening in a migration that I'm not sure if one person can handle all of the moving pieces in a migration, especially when you have to do a migration, not just for one institution, but 5 institutions that also include a research center and the National Yiddish Book Center. So, and then of course, migrating to open source. So what I find really interesting about this project and why I just really enjoy being a part of it is that the conundrums, which are not always conundrums, some of them are issues that are just inherent to migrations. They're on 3 different levels, and they're just really, really intriguing to me just to think about. So this slide tries to illustrate that with these 3 circles, the institution. Here, I'll talk more about UMass, obviously, because that's where I work, the Consortium 5C, and Folio being that open source community. So what we all share in terms of migrating to Folio is that we're all different cultures. There are resources that are extended, especially when you're building a new open source platform. I'm not sure if you can ever have enough developers on hand. And this is a whole different idea to what next gen library service platforms are as well. So it's, they're doing things in apps. So there is kind of a microservice approach to this. Of course, there's different personalities. And when you blow that up to an international level, wow, there's different languages. Of course, different politics, different types and ways of communicating, and of course, different goals and expectations. And one of the things that struck me in terms of the Folio level is you have different ideas of librarianship. A good example of that is how, for example, German libraries deal with e-resources, in comparison to many libraries in North America. Another example is data privacy, which is handled differently in Europe, especially with the GDPR laws, and North America. A more specific example is that, for example, when we're talking about tracking, cataloging statistics, do you track the person or do you make that anonymous? So that question has implications in how you actually develop that sort of tool and how you track that information in Folio. In terms of the consortium, what was really unique in terms of the issue or conundrum there is decision making. And if you remember, I brought up the 2 pyramids. It's supposed to be, two-way communication going through all the levels up to the deans of all the libraries down to the staff. But who is the final decision maker, especially when you're supposed to be aligning practices? And one of the critiques of the last migration, and I'm sure many of you have encountered this if you've done a migration, there are always staff, or not always, but there could be staff that remember the last migration. And for the 5 colleges, the principal complaint was that the needs and kind of workflows of the staff at the ground level were not taken into consideration when decisions were made. And also the decisions that were made weren't transparent. So there was confusion as to who was making those decisions and how those decisions were being shared throughout the consortium. So this is something that we are dealing with at the 5C, is how do we handle decision-making so that it is a very transparent and also inclusive process. At the institutional level, now there is, that structure of collaboration that translates to the institution, but not always. There are specific working groups. For example, at UMass, we have an events and communications team, as well as a documentation and training team. But how do those working groups relate to what is being done at the consortial level? So, there's some friction there, and there's also some friction in terms of what Folio is doing and what the consortium needs and what UMass needs in terms of its LSP or library service platform. Now, some of these are true conundrums, and perhaps there isn't an easy solution to them. Others, there are. And so what can you do with some of these conundrums? Now, again, thanks to the history of successful collaborations at 5C, from the get-go, the Folio implementation team developed these shared principles at the consortium level. What I really like about these shared principles is it gives you an idea of what the goal is of the migration and kind of the goal of what we want from collaboration, as well as how we want to treat each other in terms of how we communicate and how we collaborate. So basically, we are going to a single and shared library resource. We want to align our practices and make sure that we're all on the same page. And one of the reasons for this is, if you remember, the 5C Consortium started out offering courses to the students at all the member institutions. Now, that means that they also want access to each library's resources. Now, if you have different practices, that can get quite complicated. And we've heard from not just faculty, but students in terms of, what can they take from each library member institution? What can't they check out? What's available? What's not available? So this really aligns us to kind of the rest of the educational offerings of the 5C. And respect, obviously. We want to debate and discuss. We understand that this is a migration, and I really enjoyed, if you haven't read, and it's in my slides and I'll make it available afterward, Engard's book on practical open source software for libraries. He talks about migration being conflict. So there's always some sort of conflict going on. So we really have to debate and discuss and kind of bargain, but mediate for what we want in terms of our shared resource and alignment. At the folio level, and I should mention that those shared principles are not just for the consortial level, but each of the institutions as well. Folio has a little more of an official take on this, which is a code of conduct, which, I think many open source communities have such a code of conduct. There's a pledge, the standards, there are mechanisms to contact someone if you feel that, there was a violation of the code, and this is taken very seriously. So I think without these official mechanisms, collaborations do have trouble. So you do need kind of this framework within which to exist. So how does this help us with successful migrations and collaborations? I really like this sketch from Helen DeWard, which is an illustration of the book by Goldstein and Wellman, The Adapted School from 1999. And here, DeWard is actually illustrating the principles or norms of collaboration. So pausing to think, paraphrasing, paying attention, just making sure that you're open to creative solutions and questions. And if you don't understand, making sure that you communicate that, asking for specifics. And I think these norms of collaboration are reflected in the 5C shared principles, as well as the Folio Code of Conduct. And that's what gives kind of a framework of how we can collaborate, in not just an international project, but in the member schools for a successful migration. But it's not just about that. And I really wanted to end my presentation on saying that you have to develop a practice. And this practice is first and foremost for yourself, but hopefully, I would like to see some of these ideas expressed more in, like our shared principles or code of conduct. And these ideas are compassion, empathy, kindness, finding your support group, and I'll just say rebalancing all the time. And I think if we don't express these with ourselves, we will fall out of balance and we won't be able to collaborate. So I think, you know, if we take on too much work, if we don't have kind of a listening to ourselves that where we just say yes to everything, for example, then I think we won't be in a space to collaborate. If we don't have empathy of having or taking on someone else's perspective, then it'll be hard to understand even where they're coming from, you know, to understand their goals and maybe their different ideas of librarianship. And as a chair of one of the working groups, I try to practice these with myself to make sure that I have the room and the space and the energy to collaborate on the projects that I need to, but also with those that I lead in my working groups. And one example is that we co-facilitate one of my working groups. And I always ask if it's a problem, and I don't need to know the reason why, I can always come in for that person. And I think in particular with the times that we're living in now, it's always good to have that ability where someone just needs time to do whatever they need to do. And I have found that it is very good, and the collaborations actually work better because people have a sense of relief in terms of the work that needs to get done. But this is always you always have to come from a position of rebalancing, which is extremely important. And so I want to end just with this little image. The key to success is finding the balance between caring and not caring. And I'm not sure, I don't think I quite like caring and not caring. That's not the words that I would use, but I would say the key to success is finding the balance. And that balance is, I think, redefining what a successful collaboration means for you, first and foremost, in terms of compassion, empathy towards yourself and the other people on your project. And you always have to rebalance that, that key to collaboration and the meaning of success. And I think also redefining what success means for you and how you collaborate in the migration is key, because only then you can see that you do your part. And if you've done that successfully and you're proud of it, that's great. Now, does this mean the entire migration project will be successful in the end? Well, I don't know. There are so many things to a migration that are disruptive, and I would say try to balance yourself or have influence, a positive influence on aspects that you can, and that already is a success. And at least you won't be burnt out, and you can still talk to your colleagues afterwards. So I think it is a dual aspect. It is necessary to have the official framework in place. And if you don't have that in place, I highly encourage you to develop something, even if it's small. For example, one working group that has shared principles, for example, to also working on yourself and what it means to be successful in your collaborations. And that's my presentation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much again to Mike, Beth, and Jennifer for sharing the work that they've done and for the presentations. They provided so much for us to consider in our processes and any possible migrations in our futures. So we have about 5 minutes left. And since we are the last session of today, we could stay a little bit over to answer any questions. So if you have anything, you could put them in the chat. But first, I will start with, I think, with Mike and Beth. Let's see. So I think another attendee answered this question, but to confirm, does Matchmark only work with OCLC subscribers?
At this point, I think it was designed to work with OCLC, though I don't know what the developer's plans would be. And, you know, they're really responsive people. If you find out their contacts and reach out to them and say you have a use case, they might be willing to work with you. But I would just say follow the development of it and see what happens. I found out about it originally from the Code for Lib journal as well. So, staying abreast of those kind of sources is really great. I was very, very fortunate to find that.
One of the keys to making it work is getting your OCLC API key. So I do think you need an OCLC subscription in order to get that.
Great, thank you. And I think this one refers to your slide about scraping data. So is that ID always a panel ID, or do you have to update the formula for each URL? So for instance, inspecting HTML source for important XML queries.
So, right, in my experience, on any given website, they're going to just keep recycling the same architecture and over and over again. So every product page is going to look the same in the HTML, but the individual data will be different. So in the context of that particular website, yes, the information was always in the div that had the ID, which was called panel 1D. Ugh, I can't remember that. But on another website, it won't work because they haven't designed their website that way. So the formulas that you create are almost custom for those particular websites, except for the fact that you're going to do it over and over again, possibly over time, or possibly in one large project session. So that's sort of the bespoke part of it. You do have to adapt it for different data sources.
Let's see. Let's see if there's any more questions.
I see the one about regex here, and I will say that I did experiment with regular expressions, and I even found a really stealable formula online that let me import data and use regular expressions to parse it in Google Sheets. It worked. It just didn't happen to supplant the import XML functions I was using. So there are solutions for which a custom built formula using Google scripts. I'm sorry, I'm not getting the name of that one right. It's basically like JavaScript, but it's for Google, can work.
Okay, and then somebody asked, and this is to another attendee, but does Sky River have any APIs available? I don't know if anyone uses Sky River. Okay.
I don't have familiarity. If there's anybody on the call, feel free to speak up.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a quick question, if I could just, sorry, real quick. And I think this will be from the training perspective. I had a question about, and this actually is for both presenters, and it just has to do with how that consortial work is. Sorry if you can hear the siren. You can hear the siren through my, sorry. How the consortial work is sort of how you're sort of preparing for training and how that training is happening on the folio side in terms of workflows, obviously, metadata, acquisitions, et cetera, how that's doing. Talk about some of those bumps you're running into. And then for this point of view of the scripting, the web scraping project, how is that affecting training? Just kind of curious about how you're approaching this from your respective like departments and areas. Thank you.
Why don't we let Jennifer start?
Okay, thank you. Well, training is a good question in Folio. So what we started doing is kind of giving brief glimpses to staff. So at the institutional level. So, and kind of answering as many questions as we can answer. So there's the reason I'm giving that vague response is that there are some things still in development. So some things just haven't been finished. So we're not quite sure about the functionality as of right now. We are setting up kind of what's called a bug testing environment that will mirror our workflows. And once we have that set up, everyone throughout the consortium will go through their workflow and test it. I think at the consortial level, I do things called open houses. So for lack of a better term, we bring in, it's a virtual call. I share what the working group is doing. So my particular working group, if any decisions need to be made, we have conversations on those decisions. So that's kind of the decision-making process. And I also show functionality as well as, sometimes we have petting zoos. I'm sorry, it's Western Mass. We have names for everything. So open house, petting zoo. So the open house, we do show things. It's more demo rather than training. The petting zoos is more a hands-on workshop. So we're kind of gearing up towards the documentation and training. So it's more, we're more in the space of, how are we going to train the entire staff? So we're setting it up. So yeah.
At Penn, I would say that the training has been incremental, and one of the things we focused on first is working with staff's Excel skills. Was a place to build. And we got started in a lot of this batch work, updating Excel spreadsheets and running them through MarcEdit to create brief MARC records. We started with what vendors could give us. Sometimes they could give us an invoice as a spreadsheet rather than as a PDF. And so you do a little massaging, and then you train to get it into MARC, and staff see, oh, wow, this saves me hours of individual record work. So then you start giving them here's how you can massage this data instead of how I can massage this data. So it's an incremental step by step, just as you're figuring out, or Mike now is figuring out all the different formulas. It's not all of the things he presented, it's pieces of it as people build their skills.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One of the few bright spots of the pandemic was a work from home opportunity. And during that time, I assigned all of my staff Excel learning courses that were available through the university. I think we have a LinkedIn Learning subscription. So I had them work their way through courses and figure out basic formulas. Some of that just helps in their general working with invoices or spreadsheet data, but a lot of staff were really thrilled to be able to do things like split data apart or put it together with basic formulas like concatenate and concat that they didn't really know existed before. And they're all a lot more comfortable navigating Excel, and they feel better about it. And then from the larger standpoint of just training on how might you do web scraping or that sort of thing, I have led a couple of sessions. One was with a sort of digital humanities data interest group at our libraries and beyond. And I also presented what I was doing to what is our sort of tech services communications group that Beth is the chair of locally at Penn. And what I really wanted to do was just tell people what I was doing, how they could do it on their own, and be as transparent as I possibly could be about the work that I do at the libraries. And eventually some people will find their level of interest. They'll either be here, I can do these basic Excel things, but I need help with the rest. That's great. And some people just want to go out on their own and start exploring and doing stuff. And I had great examples of staff using analytics data to get information about performance of certain publishers in the catalog. And that led to us, pursuing an approval plan with this, with a certain vendor. So it really, I think it only serves to benefit by giving people the tools to go out and learn and find out what is their level of comfort with the technology.
Great, those are great questions. Okay, so we have two more, and then one for Jennifer. So would you speak to how the technology of Folio is affecting your own thinking and that of your department?
Definitely. Well, it's it's really shaken it up in a good way. So first, at the institutional level, I think Folio has really taken us out of being kind of a more traditional cataloging unit to more of a metadata unit, which is really good. Though it's very scary, I think, for some of our staff, because it means learning more technology. So what does that technology look like? It's, accessing records through APIs, accessing records through MySQL, accessing records through, for example, we use the Olive Reporting Center, using kind of this browser-based technology. You have to remember, we're using Olive, which is an oldie but goodie ILS system. So, a lot of people, they just went to the cataloging unit. They never saw acquisitions. They never saw, these other modules. And now they're seeing that. So they're actually getting more into the life cycle of library resources, which I think is such a good thing, because before they were kind of separated from that. So they did strange things, like, they put in for a news, and this goes way back, so maybe 20, 30 years, but they would put the call number newspapers into all of these records that were newspapers in order to have them, be discovered by users. And when you look at that today, you're like, what are you doing? How strange is that? And what's interesting is that process didn't change for some of the people because they have worked there for like 40 years. So now we're really incorporating, I think, more of a user-focused kind of approach to how we catalog, as well as more technology. And I think, from our paraprofessionals to the librarians, we're all gaining skills. And we're all, I think, learning how to be comfortable with situations that are uncomfortable or that have no answer. And that's okay. Because I think before we had to have an answer for everything. At the consortium level, what is fantastic, I think we've become closer as a community, and we're kind of using each other's strengths to move forward on the project. So for example, if I need a report out of all of ARC, so I do more with the Oracle tables rather than ARC. I go to one of my colleagues at Smith, I'm like, oh, can you get this for me? He's like, yeah, sure, no problem. And then he's like, wait, can you find this in the Oracle tables? I'm like, yeah, I'll do that for you. So I think it's like having more colleagues all of a sudden, but with different perspectives. Without the politics of your institution, if that makes sense. So I think it's been a very good thing, but it is a rocky ride. It is open source. We've never done open source. And so this means a lot of change for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think that really speaks to kind of the future of our cataloging departments and what we have to look forward to. Thank you. And so the last question is for Beth. Do you have any sense of what percentage of records that were initially loaded needed later to be overlaid, either because the original record was too brief or because it was wrong compared to the book that was actually received?
I don't have a good sense of the numbers. Mike might be able to address that, but I did want to say that one of the things when you're dealing with international vendors is that the data they give us often is not the kind of data that we're used to. ALA, LC transliteration tables are not employed internationally. They're a North American thing. So often they'll give us a transliteration in Roman characters that's just like, it's not the same. So we'll know that all of those from that vendor are gonna have to be updated to something. And we do it with batch if we can. Sometimes we have to do in title by title searching. Mike, do you have any sense of the numbers?
I think it's difficult to answer that because this is an acquisitions and cataloging process. So when the books come, someone is going to look for that book in the system and evaluate the record that's associated with it. And they're not going to be reporting back to me necessarily, oh, the record was wrong, because they accept the reality that the records in our system are always in a state of imperfection and that they can always be improved. But I would say at the initial outset, if we've got a batch of 100 ISBNs and they match 40 records in OCLC, which is about reasonable for some projects, we would look at those titles that they matched. And if those titles seem far off, we're not going to load that record. And if it seems about right, we will say, yeah, that's what we're going to use. And if it's wrong, we'll fix it. Sometimes a vendor advertises one thing but sends another. Sometimes it's a later edition or printing, or there's a title variation. So the role of the cataloger is still there at looking, is this thing the thing that's in my hand? And if it's not, making adjustments as necessary. But it really does add a lot of an audit trail. You can tell the book was the thing associated with this order, which was associated with this record. So it ends up becoming pretty easy to say, oh, well, that data wasn't perfect at the time, so let's make it better. So there are kind of checks along the way. So it's not just that, well, records are automatically loaded and books just go out the door, because someone is they have to touch the book, right? They've got to open a box and retrieve it and barcode it and flip through it and do those tasks. So a human is thankfully still involved, but they're just involved in a much smarter way for their time, rather, you know, and now with limited time on site, just with COVID safety requirements, they can do a lot of this acquisitions work from home with spreadsheets and then focus their on-site time on doing the inventory work, the checking, the looking, the barcoding, the TLC that's required for all those books. So I'm very happy with the way this workflow has worked, and they're all great problem solvers. And part of this process is training them to be problem solvers. So I really appreciate that from my staff.
Okay, great. So if no one else has any more questions, I'd like to thank you all again for attending, and especially to our presenters for just sharing their knowledge and all that great information. So thanks, and have a great rest of your week.